Hi, I'm Dr. Mark.
And I'm Dr. Michele.
And we are M&M without the sugar. We want to welcome you to Living It TV. We're excited that you could join us today. You know, a lot of times people wonder the answer to the question, why do we get fat? And society right now has gotten very large. And it's unfortunate because, as we've talked about many times, people won't ever tell you you're too fat. They tell you you're too skinny, because truly misery does love company, and people are getting more sick and more sick, and statistics are shocking.
Shocking. In fact, if you go to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control website, you will find that in 1989, obesity was unseen in any state. It just wasn't there. There was 0% obesity. Now, as time has gone on, we are now looking at a projected 2030 where 100% of the states will have an obesity rate of approximately 60%. 60%, folks, that's tragic. That's shocking. We couldn't fight a war if we wanted to. We can't get down the street to actually get our mail because we are carrying around so much extra baggage. For every pound we're overweight, it's 10 in our joints. Is it any wonder that we don't feel good, that we need to be on pain medications, that we are undergoing surgery after surgery at young ages? Perhaps we've just lost the concepts of what it really truly means to be well.
And I hope you heard those statistics from the Center for Disease Control that Dr. Michele talked about. By the year 2030, I got to say this one more time, 60 to 100% of the population is going to be, by predictions and prognostications, overweight or obese. To me, that's shocking. And the thing that she didn't tell you in regard to 1989, there were 0 states, of course we know that. But if you'll look at what happened in 1989, there was this incredible, wonderful, genius knot of an invention called the food pyramid. What was at the bottom part of the food pyramid?
Grains.
Multiple servings of
grains.
And more servings of
grains.
And even more servings of
grains.
And then what happened in that time? We ended up getting fat. Go figure what happened. In 1989, there were no states. But in 11 years, every state, with the exception of one, crossed the 20% mark in obesity. Every state but one. And that one state happened to be Colorado. It took just another 10 years for every state to cross over the 20% and many states to get into the 30-40% range. In my home state and in your home state of Oklahoma, right now we are nearing 50%. Interestingly enough, about that time in history, you're getting a great history lesson right now, because there was quite a battle in the government regarding the FDA and the farmers and all this stuff about this food pyramid. Was it right? Was it wrong? And even the opponents would fight against it. But eventually, big money won out. But I ask you, did big money win, or did we lose as society?
Society is really losing the game. And if we look at what's happening in medicine today, it's really tragic. It's really tragic, folks. We go to the doctor and we get more pills. In fact, diabetes, when I started medical school, which wasn't too long ago, I'm going to not date myself by saying the time.
She started when she was 12.
But there were only a handful of type 2 diabetic medications, maybe 6, 7, and now there are too numerous to count type 2 diabetic medications, and type 2 diabetes is on the rise. So what does that say about the fact that we actually have control over this thing we call diabetes or metabolic syndrome? We have lost the war. We've got to get control of what is controlling our society, and that's the underlying causes of health that's driven by gluttony.
With all the money spent, over 60% of all health care costs, some people say 75%, is spent on obesity-related treatment. We're going to teach you during this program what causes you to get fat. Stay with us.
When I come home after a busy day, one of the first things I want is a drink of water. That's when I turn to Culligan. Their bottleless coolers are hassle-free, more sanitary, and better for the environment. Or try an under-the-sink filtering system. This space-saving design filters water for a refreshing taste. And don't forget Culligan's water softening system. You and your home will benefit from better, cleaner water. Culligan Tulsa, your one-stop shop for water.
Welcome back to Living It TV. Listen, I'm ready to dive into this idea because many people wonder, Dr. Michele, the question, why do we get fat? Why does that happen? What's going on? And remember, we talked about, statistically speaking, it's shocking. By the year 2030, 60 to 100% of the population is predicted by the Center of Disease Control to be overweight or obese. Enough said. That's got to be fixed. It's got to be corrected right now. Going back to where we always go back, what does the Word of God say about the question, why do we get fat? There's an answer here. I don't know if you ever wondered, and if you're out there listening, you thought, does God talk about the idea of overweight? Yeah, He does. And this is a powerful, powerful passage that I discovered, and God showed us this about 2 years ago. It was crazy. So listen to this as Dr. Michele reads from Philippians chapter 3, verse 17 through 19.
Again, this is Philippians chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. Brethren, join in following my example, and note those who walk as you have us for a pattern. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. We focus on our belly as our God. How destructive is that? We have made food God.
It's amazing when you look at that passage. Now, just to set the stage, contextually speaking, Paul is talking about his accomplishments, all the things he's done, how that they're not important in regard to his pursuit of living a life in a Christ-like manner. And he's saying, follow my example. Do what I do. Don't do as you see those do that are enemies of the cross. Enemies. He doesn't say that are, okay, people just not doing what I do. He calls them enemies. One of the characteristics he gives right here, which to me just blows this thing out of the water, he talks about their destiny being destruction. We know that is separation from God in a place called hell. He also mentions their glory, that's pride is their shame. Pride comes before a fall. Right in the center. Right in the center. And I think it's no coincidence that it's right in the center of our bodies. He says their God or their belly, their God is their stomach or their God is their belly. And so when we look at this, why do we get fat? It's a misappropriation of what's important to us. We've talked about this many times before. All the things that we do in life are revolving around food.
Yeah, from social events to birthday parties to even in the church. We go to church to have donuts and coffee before service, and then we have lunch after service to fill back up on food.
Donuts and coffee? Coffee okay, in moderation. Donuts? Are you kidding me? Okay, so let's get our kids there and let's sugar them all up and kill them. Does that make sense to you? I mean, it's ridiculous. We've used sugar as actually a bait to get people to church. And I think that's just the most disgusting thing anybody could ever do. I've heard this justified. Well, that's all they're getting to eat. Well, feed them an apple for Pete's sake. I mean, use your brain. Don't use your belly, pastor. Your belly, administrator. And I'm not trying to get on you. I'm trying to speak life into you. Friends, it doesn't matter whether you're a pastor or not. We've got to quit baiting our kids with sugars. What happens? What do you get when you have a birthday?
Cake.
And what do you happen when you do an anniversary?
Cake.
And what about holidays?
Cake.
And what about every other event?
Cake.
And every other event is?
Cake.
You get it? Everything we do is about sugar, and sugar's been replaced as the most incredible, awesome, consistent reward piece. But my question is it? When you look at these trends that are driven by the high glycemic load of foods, and we're going to touch on what this means, glycemic load, we think it's no big deal. Oh, your kids don't get fat. They're skinny little munchkins. They're not showing it in the belly, so they must be able to eat anything they want. That is a tragedy, because every organ on our bodies, starting with the little kids, has a lifespan. Even with a kid, when they're eating the sugars, it's amazing how much their lifespan is being taxed and shortened later in life. So I ask you, is it really worth it? Is it really worth it to feed them sugar? The answer, I believe, is absolutely
no.
Never.
And why not? Is what happens with this syndrome of feeding an individual sugar is that we lose track of time. They call it the freshman 40, per se. Little kids, fed sugar all the time. You go off to college, you gain the freshman 40. Well, what is that? That is the precursor to type 2 diabetes. You already have your foot in a little bit of hot water. In fact, when you see that little midriff, that little muffin top, that little bit around the middle that you can pull your shirt over and just kind of pretend that it's not there, your biomarkers are already changing on the inside. And chances are, your doctor doesn't really look deep enough to say, hey look, you've got an elevated hemoglobin A1C, your HDL is dropping, your blood pressure's a little bit up, you're a little bit red in the face. What about your middle? They don't really ever address what's going on with the middle. Well, type 2 diabetes, the precursor, the beginning, the start, is that little change in the midriff. And then by the time you get to the doctor and your blood pressure's up, you're already there and on your way to metabolic syndrome. And type 2 diabetes is just a step away. Don't let it happen to you. Take charge now. Go get your biomarkers measured, find out what your baseline is, and then become allergic to sugar.
I love that, allergic to sugar. I think really, if we're honest about it, and again, this is all of us trying to do the best we can, and it's not about being judgmental in what I'm saying. It's about being honest and facing this thing. I think the reason a lot of people don't want to deal with it from a practitioner point of view, even a leader point of view, is because they've got the same thing going on themselves. They don't want to touch that because it's like forbidden territory. Don't go there. You can go anywhere but here. But let me tell you something. If we don't go there, we're going to lose a society. In my mind, this idea of type 2 diabetes is absolutely ridiculous. And I use that word intentionally, ridiculous. There is no reason for that existence of that condition on our planet. It's not hereditary. It's not genetic. It's a life choice-driven, self-imposed, elongated suicide. And that's what it is. And I know that's strong language, but it's the truth. People need the truth, Dr. Michele. They need to hear the truth from people who actually care.
Yes, and in the clinic, patients come in because they're at their wits' end. They've tried every kind of diet that they possibly can. And what are the first 3 letters of the word diet? D-I-E. So why on earth would you ever stay on a diet? It's not going to last, because about 3 days into it, you're going to feel like you want to die, and you're going to get off it, and you're going to put on more weight. It's called rebound. So we advocate a lifestyle change, lifestyle transition. You get on that train, you ride that train, and you never get off. You may have one treat. We call it the one and done. So learn about the glycemic index and the glycemic load. It's about education and understanding and knowing about what your body can do, what it can manage, and what it can handle. If you put more in it than it can handle, guess what? Your bloodstream has to stay clean. It has to stay clean at all costs. So what's it going to do? It's going to offload that excessive amount of sugar into the fat cells. And what do those fat cells do? They become inflammatory mediators. So that little bit of extra around the middle is the precursor to chronic illnesses. The precursor to all chronic illness is inflammation. Where does it start? It starts with that first step, letting your lifestyle get out of control with that little bit around the middle.
The little jiggle around the middle is not supposed to be there. Listen, I even, this is the truth, and I was debating on whether to share this or not, but I think it's very important. You know, even before we began to film this Living It TV episode, I received a text message from someone, and it was amazing. In this text message, it read something like this: my wife is really upset at me because I'm choosing to eat well. My wife thinks I should wait to do this until a later time. She is worried about me offending people when we go out to eat. I don't know what to get on the menu. I don't want to make my wife mad. You know what? Get over yourself. Are you going to lead your family or not? And I really don't care if you're listening right now or not, to be honest with you. If you don't like it, turn off the TV. You don't have to watch anymore. The bottom line is this: lead your family. Lead yourself. Do the right things. Don't care what anybody else thinks. Do the right things over and over again. It's that important. Don't you get that? It's that important. It doesn't mean you need to be militant about it. It just means make good choices and be proud of your good choices. Don't celebrate the bad ones. Holidays come and go. If you have a poor meal during the holidays, no sweat. Enjoy. It's all cool. But if you're worried about what somebody thinks all the time, why don't you worry about what you think? And then take care of yourself first. And then I think they'll find a better answer and a better result and outcome on their side.
Yeah, well, you know, when we overeat, we know we don't really feel well. We might think we feel well, but if we really stop and evaluate how we feel when we've had that indulgent Thanksgiving meal, we feel sick, we feel toxic, we feel like we've got to take a nap. Even if we overeat at lunch, we feel like we've got to take a nap. That can't be good for our brain. That can't be good for our heart. That can't be good for our long-term outcome.
So I want people to understand why it is that we begin to get that first initial sign or warning bell, if you will, about that extra weight gain. What causes that? So let's get into this idea that we call the glycemic load. Let's unravel that just a bit to explain why we put on fat.
Well, what is the glycemic load? The glycemic load is 50 grams of carbohydrates. 50 grams of carbohydrates. It doesn't matter what it is. It is the scientific measure of sugar load. So whether it's a potato, whether it's bread, whether it's an apple, 50 grams of that substance is the load. So you take that and multiply it by 4, that's 200 calories. So the glycemic load is approximately 200 calories. So if you take that times 10, how many calories do you have? So if you're eating a very large glycemic load and your body can really only handle about 50 grams at any one time, what is it doing to the rest of that? It is offloading that into the fat cells, because your body has to manage that fuel. It has to manage that substance that comes in. So that glycemic load is very important to understand. We don't sit down to a glycemic load of oatmeal. We sit down to a bowl. We don't sit down to a glycemic load of potato chips. We sit down to a bag. So now we are educated on what that glycemic load is, and it's usually one serving. So you start to turn your bags over, you start to turn your boxes over, you start to turn the labels over and look at how many carbohydrates are in there. What is the glycemic load? What is that sugar load? And Dr. Mark and I will also spend time educating you on what the glycemic index is, because the glycemic index and the glycemic load are two different things, but they need to be related together because they are both very important in understanding how your body manages fuel and how your body gets fat. If you eat foods that have too high of a glycemic index, you're gonna get fat. If you eat too much of a glycemic load, over and over and over again, you're gonna get fat. So we have to be cognizant and mindful of all of these concepts that make our systems fat.
She's beautiful and smart. Aren't I a lucky man? You know, when we eat like that, and the glycemic load comes from carbohydrates predominantly. So let me make this statement to you. You're not necessarily going to get fat eating fat. Fat comes and it develops because of excessive carbohydrates, excessive glycemic load, excessive processed foods, predominantly from carbohydrates. Now today, we know that carbohydrates are the dominant source of food. Many times we eat an overload of above 50 grams. We don't even know what 50 grams is. And when we do that, it causes our body to go into a panic mode. It's called inflammation. We're going to explain this to you in just a few. Stay with us. Welcome back to Living It TV. Now, we were talking about this concept called glycemic load. You were going to get into, Dr. Michele, this idea how it relates to glycemic index. So go ahead with that. It was fascinating.
Well, we were talking about the load. The load is really how many grams of carbohydrates you take in at one time, which is very different from the glycemic index. The glycemic index is the response of the hormone insulin to the ingested carbohydrate. So for example, you take in an apple. An apple has a very low glycemic index, which means it does not elevate that hormone insulin very much. On the contrary, if you take in a Snicker bar, it has a very high glycemic index load, which means it has a very large response of the hormone insulin. Insulin is a fat storing hormone. So the more insulin you produce by ingesting carbohydrates that have a very high glycemic index, the more fat you are going to store. The body has to take that sugar out of the blood. The bloodstream has to stay clean at all costs. So when you're taking in carbohydrates that have a very high glycemic index, insulin comes on board to the rescue to get that sugar out of the blood. And where does it store it? It's going to store it in the fat cells. And fat cells kind of become this repository of this toxic stuff, and it creates inflammation. In fact, the fat that sits around the middle has become its own endocrine organ. It is so incredibly inflammatory that it is a precursor to chronic disease. And one of those diseases is diabetes. So now we know the difference between the carbohydrate load. The carbohydrate load is how much. The glycemic index is how much that sugar causes insulin to rise. And insulin is a fat storing hormone. It stores fat around the middle.
So here's the lesson. When insulin is elevated through a nutritional program that's high in higher glycemic carbohydrates, or much less high in carbohydrates, period, it elevates insulin. When insulin is elevated, you cannot access stored fat. Therefore, you're a fat storer as opposed to a fat burner. Now, many different types of foods have different glycemic index numbers. How does that work?
Well, we want the goal of the glycemic index to stay very low. That means between, say 40 or less. That is a low glycemic index. But if you stay somewhere between 40 and 60, that is a moderate glycemic index. If it's 60 or above, that's a very high glycemic index. So the higher your nutritional protocol is in the glycemic index, the more likely you are to store that fat around the middle. So you start moving that glycemic index towards low, which is 40 or less, you are going to have a much more capacity to burn that fat, not to store fat, and not have to become diabetic.
So our goal is to control the level of insulin. So we made it super easy for you. We created these glycemic index food chart cards for you, and if you want to go to our website and grab one of these things immediately, and you can download it for free, it doesn't cost anything, it's going to help you. And I want to give you a couple numbers, for example. We've talked many times about too much bread, and the bread and the sugars that have this high glycemic load. So this card is laid out for you that 0 to 44 is considered healthy, 45 to 60 is moderate, and above 61 or more is considered high. So if you'll use your carbohydrate calculators here we've given you, select the ones that you're 80% of the ones you consume in the low category, only 20% in the moderate, avoid the high, you'll be in good shape. And guess what's not on here? Green vegetables. Therefore, they are always low. Couple numbers that you'll find fascinating. We've been told that wheat bread is much more beneficial than white bread. So what we understand that wheat bread has a glycemic index of 69, and that's wheat bread, and white bread has a glycemic index of 71. Much different?
Much different.
Yeah, understand, we look at this whole concept. The highest, most readily consumed vegetable today in America is white potato. That is a 66. So, friend, do yourself a favor. These are great cards, front and back. You got the numbers here. We want you to have these in your hands, so go to our website. While you're there, connect with us. Get online with us with the newsletter. We want you to be a part of our community. Dr. Michele and I, we love you. You're a part of our lives. We want to be a part of yours. So let's spread this message more together. Get a copy of our book. You need that. You've seen it on the screen. It's inspirational to you. It's information you need to keep you encouraged and keep you engaged. Well, look up, and we're out of time for today, and we hope you enjoyed our time today with you. We did, of course. I'm Dr. Mark.
And I'm Dr. Michele.
And we are M&M
without the sugar.
And we'll be back next time. See you later.